Do you like viral? Do you like never dying? And do you think that the meatballs are the best thing about IKEA? If yes, then, well, there's a Warframe for that. That's right, baby. Today we're talking about Grendel. You've been asking me to cover him for ages, and oh boy, has he gotten stronger in 2026. So, in this Warframe guide, we're going to talk about Grendel, what he can do, and I have multiple incredibly strong and funny builds prepared for you. As always, big shout out to all these lovelies right here, and now, let's jump right into it. But, as per usual, let's first of all dive into his kit and go over what his abilities actually do, starting out with the passive. Grendel, as most of us probably know, can eat enemies and store them in his belly. To be more precise, up to 5 at a time. The enemies that you've eaten will be displayed in the bottom right corner of the screen, and the passive ability is that for each enemy in your belly, you will get plus 250 bonus armor. This means, at maximum, you can get up to plus 1250 bonus armor. However, I should say that this armor bonus updates constantly as enemies get into and out of your gut. Ability number 1 is called Feast, and this is the skill that actually does the enemy eating. When you cast it, you will stand still for a short while and turn into a sort of vacuum cleaner that soaks up enemies in a cone in front of you. As we just said, you can eat up to 5 enemies at once, and the enemies that are inside your gut will be displayed on the bottom right corner of the screen. While being inside of your belly, these enemies will lose 2% of their maximum hit points per second while they are digested. On top of that, there are a couple more details here, such as, for example, that you're not only eating enemies, but also pickups, and you can even soak up hand grenades, which will then explode in your belly, deal damage to nearby enemies, but not to you. Now, one little problem that I have with this ability is the fact that you're basically standing still while you're casting this, so it can get a bit obstructive at times. That's why I personally like to put a bit of casting speed on my Grendel to speed up the whole process. The wiki does say that casting speed only affects the opening and closing of your gut and not the actual soak-up time itself. However, in my personal opinion, and that is purely subjective, given how often we repeat that, I think even a marginal speed up is gonna compound over time. If you disagree though, that is perfectly fine as well, then just don't go for casting speed on him. Now, the wiki also mentions a couple of edge cases in which you can't eat up enemies, but I don't want to mention every single thing individually, so I'm going to put you the screenshot on screen. You can read through it if you like. It mostly boils down to if enemies are currently crowd controlled by a different Warframe ability, this can make it so that you can't soak them up. Now, Feast also has an augment called Gourmand. I think it is French, at least in my headcanon it's French, and what this one does is pretty straightforward. Instead of using up energy to soak up the enemies, you're now going to consume a bit of health, essentially making it so that you can always eat. On top of that, it also modifies your passive by giving you an additional 150 armor per enemy in your belly. If you ask me, this is definitely a nice stat boost, and if you have one mod slot free at the end that you don't know what to put in, this would be a nice candidate. However, on the other hand, I also think this is far from necessary to have. Oh yeah, one more thing, post MHBlacky here. If you want to, you can also hold down the ability button to spit out all the enemies that are currently in your belly. This will deal a bit of toxin damage to them, but being 100% honest, I think you're not really gonna do that. Just wanted to mention it for completion's sake. Ability number 2 is called Nourish, probably the skill that all of us know best, and being 100% honest here, Nourish is arguably the best ability in the entire game. First of all, in order to cast it in the first place, you need to have at least one enemy in your belly. If you don't have anything, you can't cast it. You will then, when you cast the ability button, damage one of the enemies in your belly, usually the one that you ate first, and for that, you will gain a couple of things. First of all, you will get one massive burst of heal for yourself. With enough ability strength, one cast of Nourish will heal you full instantly. On top of that though, you and allies within range will get 3 incredibly massive buffs. Number 1, you get an energy income multiplier. This means while Nourish is active, all sources of energy income, really all sources of energy income, will be multiplied by 2 times at base, but it scales with ability strength, meaning if you have high strength, you're gonna get absolutely ridiculous crazy energy income. On top of that, you will also get a viral damage bonus to all your weapons and certain abilities. What does this mean? Well, the viral bonus from Nourish is considered a universal weapon elemental damage bonus. And given the spaghetti code nature of Warframe, there are quite a lot of things in the game that scale with those universal bonuses that technically should not. If you want to learn more, then you can check out the Universal Weapon Bonuses section in the Warframe wiki. However, for Grendel himself, this feature doesn't really matter. It's only if you use Nourish as Helminth ability. And then, as if all of that is not crazy enough, thirdly, we also have the passive viral priming. Whenever Nourish is on and you take any type of damage, you're gonna cause a viral explosion that inflicts 10 viral stacks on all enemies in range. Yeah, that is ridiculously crazy. To be fair, this explosion has a 2-second cooldown that can't be modified in any way, but still, just imagine that you put 10 viral stacks on all the enemies around you every 2 seconds. So yeah, long story short, Nourish, arguably the best ability in the game, have it up all the time. There's also an augment called Hearty Nourishment, and what this one does is, when you cast it, you clear all negative status effects on yourself, and on top of that, gain status immunity based on how many enemies are in your belly. The more you have, the longer the status immunity is gonna last. Now, for this augment, it's a pretty black and white situation. If you want to go level cap, long endurance, situations where one negative status effect can really screw you over, then Hearty Nourishment is a very, very good augment. But if you're playing the quote-unquote normal enemy levels up to Steel Path level 500 Archimedia, then in my opinion, you don't really need this. Skill number 3, Pulverize. This one is really hilarious because you turn yourself into an IKEA meatball. When you cast Pulverize, you will curl up into your ball form. While you're in this ball form, you're basically bouncing around like a ping pong ball through the level. If you crash into an enemy, you will ragdoll them away and deal a little bit of toxin damage, and you can also jump where, if you land, you're going to cause an impact AoE that will also deal toxin damage. Every time you bounce into an enemy or you cause this shockwave, the affected enemies will also lose a portion of their armor, scaling with ability strength, so you're usually going to full strip on most builds. What's more interesting with Pulverize though, would be how exactly it interacts with your energy. See, Pulverize is technically a channeled ability. However, it will only consume energy when your stomach is empty. Why is that important? Well, because of the energy regain mechanics. As you probably know, when you have a channeled ability, then you can't use any energy over time refills, right? You can only use flat increases, like energy orbs. With Grendel though, that's a little bit different. First off, yes, you can of course use flat energy refills. However, when your gut is full and you're not consuming energy per second, then you can actually restore energy over time by using Rally Point, Energy Siphon, or Wellspring, the thing from the Xenoric Focus School. This is actually very cool because it means as long as you soak up enough enemies to have a full belly, you can just use your Xenoric to refill energy no problem. Also, when you're in your ball form, you can of course not use any weapons, that is unfortunate, but you can still use all your other abilities without having to get out of the ball form. Only exception here is if you infuse a Helminth ability, then that Helminth ability cannot be cast while in ball form, but all of his own abilities can be used this way. So yeah, long story short, if you like, you can just stay in ball form forever. And yes, we're totally gonna have a build for that later as well. Now, Pulverize 2 has an augment called Catapult, and this one is great for the memes. You can use what I think is supposed to be your melee button to launch Grendel forward in his ball form super duper fast. This whole thing costs a bit of energy, and that's basically it. Super crazy mobility. Depending on the tileset, this can be very fun, or also very frustrating. I'd say just test it out for yourself, because Catapult is an Excellus mod, so it won't mess up with your regular build. And last but not least, let's talk about Regurgitate, his big bada-boom ultimate. When you cast this one, then Grendel will spit out one of the enemies in his belly onto the battlefield. Whenever this enemy then bounces into something, they will create an explosion where every enemy in that radius will lose a portion of their armor and take a bunch of toxin damage. All of this scaling with ability strength. The armor will be fully reduced at 134%, which is great. And also, according to the wiki, the enemy armor reduction actually is calculated before the damage is being dealt. So the ability itself benefits from its own armor strip right away. The cool thing here though is how the toxin damage is calculated. Yes, you have a pretty high flat amount, but it also adds 10% of the current health of the enemy that you're launching. In other words, this ability kinda sorta scales with enemy level and therefore remains relevant, especially in very high levels. That is super cool. Oh yeah, and you're also triggering a guaranteed toxin status effect on all enemies in range. Long story short, Regurgitate is a very strong ability, dealing decent damage, which gets even better in high enemy levels, plus it has the armor strip. However, what really takes the prize here would be the augment called Gastro. With this one, regurgitated enemies will bounce up to 3 times and create gas clouds at the same time that will inflict nearby enemies with gas status effect. Yeah, this is incredibly strong, and if you want to build Grendel into Regurgitate where you just vomit out the enemies at each other, then Gastro is an absolute must-have. I will say though, I've noticed the gas just replaces the toxin. Just saying, if you want to make any Archon continuity-based builds where you're dead set on wanting that corrosive status, it can be a bit difficult to do that constantly when using Gastro. And as always, would be also really cool if you could leave a quick like for the video, because it helps big time with the YouTube algorithm. So thank you so much for your support. But now that we talked about his skills, let's finally get into the build section. And here I very quickly want to start out with a cheap beginner build for those who don't want to invest all too heavily into him. This right here is already it, right? I didn't even use a full build because genuinely Grendel kinda sorta doesn't need it. Just one thing I want to say before the entire build section, yes, I have 8 Forma on him, and yes, 5 of these are Omniforma. However, that is just for my personal build testing, okay? That does not mean that if you want to copy any of today's build, that you're really going to need all that much. Just keep that in mind, it's much cheaper. But yeah, for this beginner build, what we do here, pretty simple. Aura is absolutely free, use whatever you like. Excellent slot, if you want to use it, do that, if not, you don't have to. For your survivability, Grendel has a lot of health as well as armor, so we go with Vitality and Steel Fiber. Don't really need to bother with the shield because that's basically 0 anyway. Then, for our energy income, we go with Hunter Adrenaline, which is not all that difficult to get, and it's very nice because you get energy whenever you get hit, which is easy because you're a health tank, a big health tank. Add to that the fact that you're going to have Nourish on, and the little bit of energy that you get from Hunter Adrenaline will all of a sudden matter a lot. If you wanted to, you could go and use something like Flow for more maximum energy, probably recommended, but you're also going to have so much energy regeneration that it doesn't matter all too much. And then I just added some strength, some duration, and some range, cheap mods. If you want to swap out anything, then totally go and do that. The more strength you have, the better. That's usually the one to focus on. So yeah, that would be it for the cheap or beginner build. Up next, we're gonna dive into multiple different Steel Path builds that I have prepared for you, but for this Grendel guide, I actually want to switch up my structure a bit compared to my usual build guides. See, on most Warframes, very different builds have very different requirements with regards to Helminth abilities as well as Archon Shards. With Grendel on the other hand though, this is kinda not a thing. So, instead of going over the same thing over and over again, let's just go over Helminth and Archon Shards once, and then we'll go through all the builds right away. But yeah, Helminth abilities. What do we have to talk about here? Well, to be perfectly honest, there's literally nothing that I have to recommend here. Grendel is perfectly fine with his base kit right out the gate, meaning you don't even need a Helminth ability to begin with. If, however, you wanted to use one, then really go for whatever you like. If you just want more damage, go for Roar. It's boring, but it's incredibly strong. If you want to be invisible, there's a skill for that. If you have very funky niche ideas for meme builds, then also here, right, do your worst. Grendel does not need any specific Helminth ability to work. The more interesting question here would be which ability to subsume over if you decide to use the Helminth. Well, first of all, as we already established, Nourish is arguably the best ability in the game, so you would be pretty insane to throw that out. And if you want to use Nourish, then that also means you have to keep your first, as that is the one that fuels Nourish. Leaves us with only a 3 or your 4. And here, well, it comes down to personal preference. If you don't enjoy his ball movement mechanics, then the 3 is absolutely safe to replace. Actually, I think most builds go over that. However, if you like the rollies and you want to keep that ability, then the 4 is actually your only option. It is perfectly viable to do that, however, I do want to say that your 4 is the only ability with a decent amount of damage output. If you're okay to stick to weapons only, then it's fine to throw that out. But whoever says Helminth also has to say Archon Shards, so let's also quickly cover that. First of all, similar to the Helminth abilities, Grendel really does need any shards to work. From my experience, if you use shards, that's usually only to even out some wonky numbers. What I did in the background right here is a mishmash of shards that does exactly that for multiple different builds. First of all, 2 yellow shards for more casting speed. This isn't 100% necessary, but given the fact that you need to consume a lot of enemies all the time to fuel your abilities, it's just really convenient to be able to do that a bit quicker. Another thing that I did is I added blue shards to give me more maximum energy. Given the fact that Grendel is so incredibly good with refilling his own energy, it means that I can get away with not using a flow mod. And then lastly, I added another 2 blue ones that give me a total of plus 300 armor. Also here, it's just to even out a couple of numbers for a specific build where I use Arcane Persistence. And as we all know, Arcane Persistence is very reliant on your armor, and with these 2 shards, I'm just being more consistent with that build. I'm gonna get back to these examples as we get into those specific builds. Just one very important thing to keep in mind, I built my Grendel to be able to test multiple different builds. If you, personally, wanted to play him into only one specific playstyle, then that also means you can commit way more Archon Shards to that playstyle, and your total shard layout would probably look much different. But okay, with the Helminth and the Archon Shards out of the way, let's get into the Steel Path modding. And the first build that I want to talk about today would be a Grendel Gunrunner / Gun Buffer build. For this one, I actually have 2 different variations. See, while Grendel might not be the craziest gun buffer in the game, he still offers quite a lot of utility. On the one hand, you can of course buff your viral damage with Nourish, and then you're very tanky on top, which is nice. However, especially in 2026, we do have a couple of gun arcanes that are perfectly tailored towards Grendel. Number 1 would be one of my favorites, Primary Bulwark. This one gives you a massive 500% base damage bonus, and all you need to do for that is have a lot of armor on your Warframe. With someone like Grendel, who already has crazy armor to begin with, and also gets the armor from his passive, that means you can basically constantly have Bulwark up, and that is nice because it doesn't need any stacks like most other primary arcanes. Perfect for boss fights or other scenarios where there's not enough small enemies around. And then on the other hand, you can build Grendel to have tons of maximum energy, which is perfect for primary overcharge, giving you plus 350 whopping % multi-shot. So let's get into the build itself. Now, first of all, with the build, I just infused Roar over my 4 because why not? It's more damage. However, you don't have to do that. The mods themselves then look like this. I personally have invested in Umbra Forma to go for triple Umbral because it's just so perfect on him. You get more health, more ability strength, more armor. It's amazing. If you don't want to do the Umbra Forma though, it's fine, you can go double Umbra and leave one of them out. It's not going to break your back. I do want to say though that because I have triple Umbra, I did not have enough mod capacity to actually use an Exila slot, which is unfortunate. The name of the game for this build then is Strength, as you can also see here pretty clearly. More strength means more viral from Nourish, means more damage bonus from Roar, means more everything. So we go with Growing Power, Transient Fortitude, Blind Rage, Umbral Intensify with a massive 77% with the other 2 ones, and I also go for Arcane Bellicose, which is easily maxed out on Grendel with all his health. For the survivability, I go with Adaptation, which in combination with all the armor and the heal that we're getting from our 3 whenever we roll up into it, that is going to be more than enough to keep us alive at standard Steel Path levels. However though, if you want to go long endurance, that is what the second variant of this build is for, which we're going to talk about in just a couple of seconds. The energy income then is handled by Energy Nexus, which gives us 3 energy regen per second. Usually not really all that great, but if we take into account that we have a 5 times multiplier with Nourish, that all of a sudden means 15 energy per second, and that becomes very relevant. Add to that you might want to use the Zeneric Focus School, and all of a sudden those 15 energy per second are going to be turned into, 8 times 5, 40 energy per second. Absolutely crazy. Now, when it comes to the arcanes though, you are a bit free to do whatever you like. Yes, Arcane Bellicose is great, but technically you would survive even without it. So what you can do is, you can replace these arcanes, if you like to, you can replace them with stuff to buff your weapons. Whichever weapon class it is that you play, there's usually some kind of arcane that makes it much stronger. For example, if you have a primary, you can go for Arcane Rage, that's more base damage. If you have a secondary, we have the very overpowered Arcane Velocity for Fire Raid, or, what else do we have? Arcane Precision for plus 300% damage. Want to go for melee Grendel? No problem, you can go Arcane Strike, more attack speed, or Arcane Hotshot for more crit chance, Arcane Avenger, Arcane Crepuscular, whatever, right? What I'm trying to say is, Grendel does not necessarily need so much arcane attention here, so you can really go and use these 2 slots to buff up your weapon of choice. However, what if normal level Steel Path survivability is just not gonna cut it for you? Well, then we're gonna go with the tanky version of this build, which switches up a couple of things a little bit. What we do here is, we go for Arcane Persistence, our good old friend. If you have at least 700 armor, then you can never lose more than 500 damage per second, regardless of the enemy's strength. This is very cool because it means that combined with your ridiculous heal rate on Pulverize, you're basically unkillable. Even at level cap, it's like they're barely going to be able to out-damage your heal. It's totally crazy. Also here, we go for a lot of ability strength, sure. However, there is one major difference, and that is that this mod slot right here is kind of flexible. The reason I used Naira's Hatred here is mainly because I didn't have much mod space due to my triple umbral setup, but if you wanted to use something else, you totally put that in here. I personally got a 1400 armor, meaning even if I eat a heat proc, I'm still over 700, and those 1400 armor are because I have 2 armor shards in here. If you didn't have these 2 armor shards, then you might want to put in an armor mod right here that would help out with that. Just, giving you some suggestions. Also, another thing, if you know that you're going to go with the Zeneric for your energy income, then you technically don't need Energy Nexus, and you could swap it out for something like Flow. Or at least if you actually did have mod capacity. As I said, Grendel is very flexible when it comes to how exactly you want to build him. But now, what if the boring old Gunrunner Grendel just doesn't cut it for you? What if you want to goof out as a Swedish meatball? Well, then this right here would be the build for you. The purpose of this build is basically to constantly stay in your meatball form while soaking up enemies and then spitting them out again to deal most of your damage with your 4th ability. First of all, one thing I need to make very clear is my aura selection right here. Or rather, why I didn't use anything else, why I didn't use any of the common things. Well, the reason is that technically, none of the other auras here really matter all too much, right? Growing Power can't trigger that because we're not using guns with this setup. Corrosive Projection, enemy armor strip, very cool, but then again, you're already stripping enemy armor left and right by just being present anyway. Brave Respite, we're not shield gating. Energy Siphon, well, plus 0.6 energy isn't really all that great, even with Nourish on, and if we wanted to, we could just use Wellspring from our Zeneric Focus School, so duh. And then as you think about it more and more, you will see that all the auras just really don't matter all too much. So I just went for physique to have a little bit more health, but you can just go for whatever you like. Doesn't really matter here. What does matter though is Catapult. Because of course, right, we're meatballing, so for the memes we have to use it. The build itself then focuses on a lot of ability strength, of course for the damage, but also ability range so that we have more of an explosive radius on our Regurgitate. I personally went for Overextended and Stretch, however if you don't want to sacrifice that much ability strength with Overextended, it is fine if you go for, Augur Reach instead. You lose a lot of range, but you gain a lot more damage. I personally think the Overextended is fine. One must-have with this build though would be Gastro, the Augment 4R4. I previously mentioned it, this one covers the entire room in gas clouds, which will give you crazy KPM. The enemies might not die right away from the initial explosion, but the gas clouds are so strong, it's hilarious. Also here, survivability comes from the heal from a Pulverize in combination with Arcane Persistence and exactly 700 armor. These 700 also go down to the 2 Archon Shards that I have right here. If you don't have them, then unfortunately with this build setup right here, you would have to use a mod to get there. But alright, these would be the 2 main playstyles for Grendel, the Gunrunner as well as the crazy Meme Ball. However, with the last update, we received a very strong and pretty funny Helminth ability called Jade Stars. And of course, it wouldn't be an MHBlacky video if we didn't slap Jade Stars onto literally every frame. So let's also take a look at this last build right here, this super duper strong room nuking Jade Stars Grendel. The thought behind this build is actually pretty simple. Just like with the previous one, our main source of damage is going to be Regurgitate, spitting out the enemies causing the explosions and the gas. However, here, we're not going to do that as our rolling meatball, but on foot while using normal weapons and stuff. That is why we replace our third ability with the Jade Stars. But, and this is very important, there is much more to it. First of all, we quickly need to talk about Jade Stars itself, because it has a weird little interaction that we're exploiting here. See, by default, Jade Stars can't crit. However, it does have a crit chance and crit damage value in the game code, just that the crit chance is 0% and the crit multiplier is 1 times. What that means though is, we can use Arcane Avenger to increase the crit chance from 0 to all of a sudden 45%. And we can use flat crit damage bonuses, like Tenacious Bond and Arcane Crepuscular, to increase the crit damage multiplier from 1 times to 5.2 times. Now, all of a sudden, the non-critting Jade Stars are critting for 5 times the damage. So yeah, when we're talking about the mods themselves, this right here is exactly what we're doing. Arcane Avenger to get us the crit chance that we need, and Arcane Crepuscular for the fat crit damage multiplier. Now, you might wonder, how are we going to trigger this, because it only works when we're invisible? And the answer here is actually pretty simple. We go with the Shade Sentinel or the Huras Kubro as our companion. Just in case you're interested, this right here would be my Shade build, but you don't have to carbon copy it, just Tenacious Bond is interesting here. And then I use the Volcax in order to be able to trigger Tenacious Bond, because you need at least 50% crit chance for that. That's really all there is to it. Back to the mods though, let's talk about what's going on here. First of all, we're not really going to use weapons and therefore going to be invisible most of the time. That is why we have to use Combat Discipline in order to be able to trigger our Arcane Avenger. Otherwise, we're just not going to get hit enough as Invisible Frame to even activate this. For the stats of the build themselves then, we go for a lot of ability strength, because that means more status effects from the Jade Stars skill, as well as ability range so that the AoE of Jade Stars is even bigger. I personally decided to go for Archon continuity for a little bit of duration, but you could also just use primed continuity as we're gonna armor strip everything all the time anyway, so it's not really necessary here. What is more necessary in my opinion would be Archon Vitality. This one is unfortunately not going to double every status effect of your Jade Stars right here, just add one additional one to the pile, but still it is more heat. If you wanted to, however, you could drop this for any other mod, because we don't really need it for survivability as we are invisible anyway. What we do have to have, though, is Gastro. I mentioned it previously, causing the gas clouds, everything, it's just gonna turn your entire screen into a damage number simulator, the game. It's absolutely crazy, I love it, you have to try out this build, it's just really, really strong. I should say though, with Grendel, when you use Jade Stars, there is one little wonky interaction that is weird, however, it doesn't really break the build. Whenever you trickle down the health of the enemies in your belly, that for some reason triggers the Jade Stars onto the enemies that are inside of you, which will lead to this weird thing where the Jade Stars are actually shooting at yourself. Sometimes they will bounce in a way that they actually damage nearby enemies, but most of the time it's just a weird thing that's going on, but it doesn't really do anything positive or negative for us. Just wanted to mention it in case you're wondering what's going on. And now, also check out my top 10 Warframes for 2026 right here. Big thank you to Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Underkanye 2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morazaki, Antares, Patrasader, Boomia 1, Zave, Awendai, Ascension, Quax, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthrealed, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yaku Ivan Gonzalez, G. Schnoz, Muffdis, Crunju, Lishuga, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, have a nice weekend.